The day my brothers sold our father's company, I was sitting in a hospital waiting room 40 minutes away, holding a paper cup of cold coffee and praying the surgery had gone well. I didn't find out what Elliott had done until 3 days later. Not from him, not from our mother, from a former employee. A man named Carl, who had worked in my father's warehouse for 19 years, who called me because he'd heard I didn't know, and because his conscience wouldn't let him stay quiet. Carl told me, in the careful, apologetic tone of someone delivering news they wish they didn't have, that Hargrove Industries had taken over Alderman Fabrication, that the deal had closed, that the staff had been notified that morning, and that my brother Elliott's name was the only one on the sale agreement. My father had built Alderman Fabrication over 31 years. He started it in a rented garage with second-hand equipment and a single client, a small auto parts distributor who needed custom metal brackets and volume. He grew it the way he did everything, slowly, stubbornly, without shortcuts. By the time I was in high school, Alderman employed 60 people and had contracts across 4 states. By the time Dad retired, it was turning 8 figures in annual revenue and had a reputation in the industry that money alone couldn't buy. He left it to both of us. I was certain of that. I had been in the room when he said it. I had watched him sign things. I believed, with the particular confidence of someone who has witnessed something with their own eyes, that I knew exactly what the plan was. I was wrong about how much I knew, but I was not wrong about what my father intended. And the distinction between those two things, between what I knew and what my father had actually arranged, is where this entire story turns. My name is Renata Alderman Cole, and this is the story of how I lost everything in a single phone call and then got it all back in a single sentence from a lawyer I had never met before. My father, James Alderman, was a man of very few words and very precise actions. He did not say "I love you" easily, but he showed up. He showed up at every school play, every graduation, every hard conversation his children needed him to have. He showed up at the factory floor at 6 a.m, even when he had a board meeting at 9. He showed up for his employees in ways that a lot of business owners of his generation never did. Profit sharing, health coverage that was better than the industry standard, a policy of promoting from within that meant Carl, the man who called me, had gone from working the floor to running the shipping department over the course of 2 decades. Elliott was 7 years older than me. He was the firstborn, and in the Alderman family, that meant something. Not everything, but something. Dad treated us differently. I recognized it even as a child without bitterness. Elliott got more of the explicit mentorship, more of the, "Come sit with me and I'll show you how this works." I got something else. I got the version of my father who talked about things when his guard was down, the conversations after dinner when everyone else had drifted off, the drives to the airport when he'd muse out loud about the business, about the industry, about what he wished he'd done differently. I absorbed those conversations like water into dry ground. I didn't know I was being educated. I thought I was just being included. Elliott joined the company at 28 and was good at the parts of it that were visible. Sales, relationships, the front-of-house energy of running a business. He could walk into a room and make a deal feel like a certainty. Dad valued that. He made Elliott the public face of Alderman Fabrication in its later years, which suited Elliott perfectly, and which, I see now, also suited my father's plans in ways that weren't obvious at the time. I worked in the company differently. I came in laterally, in my mid-30s, after a career in operations consulting. I wasn't given a grand title. I was given problems, the kind of operational inefficiencies that cost a company margin without anyone being able to put their finger on exactly why. I fixed them, quietly, systematically. I brought in a supply chain restructure that saved the company nearly $400,000 in its first year. I built out a quality management system that got us certified for 2 new federal contract categories. I did not go to the ribbon cuttings. Elliott went to the ribbon cuttings. I went to the meetings where someone needed to explain, in plain language, exactly why a particular process was failing and what would fix it. Dad saw all of it. He saw both of us completely clearly, I believe. Clearer than either of us saw ourselves, and certainly clearer than we saw each other. When his health began declining seriously about 4 years before his death, he started spending time with his estate attorney, a woman named Patricia Voss, who had handled his legal affairs for nearly 2 decades. He saw her frequently. He revised documents. He made provisions. He was, I understand now, building something with as much care as he'd ever built anything in that garage 30 years ago. He just wasn't broadcasting what he was doing. He died on a Thursday morning in October, at home, with my mother and me beside him. Elliott was in transit from a business trip and arrived 3 hours after. I remember watching him walk through the door of my parents' house and seeing the grief on his face and feeling, in spite of everything that would come later, that it was genuine. Elliott loved our father. He just also had a plan for what came next. A plan he had been developing, I would later learn, for longer than any of us realized. The weeks after Dad's death were a cascade of logistics, the way death always is. The calls, the arrangements, the guests, the food, the thank you notes. Elliott handled most of the public-facing parts of it, which felt natural given his temperament, and I handled the private parts, which also felt natural. What I didn't handle, and what I didn't know needed handling, was the company. I assumed there would be a process. I assumed Patricia Voss would schedule a meeting, that the estate would go through its proper channels, that Elliott and I would sit down together with the appropriate people and discuss what came next. I had no reason not to assume this. It was simply what you did. What Elliott did was different. He had been in contact with Hargrove Industries, a large regional manufacturing conglomerate that had been circling Alderman fabrication for years, before our father was even buried. I don't know exactly when those conversations started. I suspect they had started before Dad died. I suspect Elliott had been watching the horizon, calculating the moment, timing his move with the same precision he used to close deals. He was very good at timing. It was one of the things about him I had always genuinely admired. Within 6 weeks of Dad's death, Elliott had completed the sale. He had presented himself to Hargrove as the authorized representative of the estate. He had used documents that I would later learn had been altered in ways that were not immediately obvious, to support that representation. He had signed a sale agreement for $34 million, with the proceeds designated for deposit into an estate account that he alone controlled access to. He told me, after Carl called me and I confronted him directly, that he had done what was necessary, that Hargrove had offered a fair price and the offer had a window, that Dad would have wanted the company to continue operating under professional management rather than being split between two heirs who might disagree about direction. He said all of this calmly, in the controlled, reasonable tone he used for difficult conversations, the tone that always made you feel like the irrational one for being upset. I told him I was going to call Patricia Voss. He told me that Patricia had retired and that her files had been transferred to another firm. He said it matter-of-factly, the way you mentioned something that's simply a logistical detail. I noticed even then, through the shock and the anger, that he said it too quickly, like he'd prepared for that sentence. I called Patricia Voss's old office the next morning. Her files had indeed been transferred, but the paralegal I spoke to, after some hesitation, gave me a name. The attorney who had received my father's file was a man named Theodore Marsh, with an office 2 towns over. I called him that afternoon. He was expecting my call. Theodore Marsh's office was nothing like what I expected. I'd imagined something formal and imposing, given what I was about to walk into. Instead, it was a converted Victorian house on a side street, with mismatched furniture in the waiting room and a reading lamp that buzzed faintly. Theodore himself was a tall, unhurried man in his mid-50s, with wire-framed glasses, and the manner of someone who had spent decades sitting across from people in crisis and had learned that stillness was the most useful thing he could offer. He had my father's file on the desk. It was thick. He had clearly already reviewed it thoroughly because there were tabs, dozens of small colored tabs, marking different sections. He offered me water. I accepted. He waited until I was settled, and then he said, "Your father was very thorough." He opened the file to the first tab. What Patricia Voss and my father had built together over the final 4 years of his life was not a standard estate plan. It was a structure, layered, interlocking, and very deliberately designed to withstand exactly what Elliott had done. The first layer was a revocable living trust, converted to irrevocable upon Dad's death, which held 49% of Alderman Fabrications shares in my name. The second layer was a shareholder agreement, co-signed by my father and myself nearly 3 years earlier. I had signed it at Dad's kitchen table on a Sunday afternoon, and he had told me simply that it was some housekeeping, and I had signed it because I trusted him and hadn't asked enough questions. That agreement required the consent of both named shareholders for any transfer of ownership above 5% of outstanding shares. Elliott's sale was a transfer of 100% of outstanding shares. He had done it without my consent, without apparently even knowing I was a named shareholder. He had either not read the documents carefully enough, or he had read them and believed they could be worked around, or, and this possibility chilled me in a way the others didn't, he had not had access to the real documents at all, and whatever he'd used to represent the estate to Hargrove Industries was not what was actually in my father's files. Theodore looked at me over his glasses. "The sale," he said carefully, "is legally void. Your signature was required. It was never obtained. The agreement is unenforceable." He paused. "Hargrove's own legal team will reach the same conclusion the moment they review the shareholder documentation, if they haven't already." They had already. Theodore had received a call from Hargrove's general counsel that morning. I want to stop for a moment here and tell you something about how I felt sitting in that office, because I think it matters. I was not triumphant. I know that's what people expect in a story like this. The moment of revelation is supposed to feel like victory, clean and sharp and satisfying. What I actually felt was something closer to grief. Grief for what had happened to my family, grief for what Elliott had become, or perhaps had always been, in ways I'd refused to see clearly. Grief for my father, who had known enough about his own son to spend 4 years building a legal architecture designed to prevent exactly this outcome, and who had died without ever having to say that out loud, without ever having to look at Elliott and tell him what he suspected. Dad protected us both from that conversation. I'm still not sure whether to be grateful or to wish he'd had it. What happened after Theodore's revelation was not a single dramatic moment. It was a process, a long, exhausting, expensive process involving several attorneys, forensic accountants, and ultimately a mediation that lasted 2 full days and produced an agreement that none of us found satisfying, but all of us could live with. Elliott was required to unwind the sale. Hargrove, to their credit, had competent counsel who had already identified the problem and was motivated to resolve it without litigation. The deal was voided. The company came back into the estate. Elliott retained his portion of the shares as specified in Dad's documents, a 40% stake, and I retained mine. We were co-owners of Alderman Fabrication, exactly as our father had intended, with a shareholder agreement that made it functionally impossible for either of us to act unilaterally in ways that affected the other. The question of what to do with that arrangement, with a company you co-own with someone who tried to sell it out from under you, is not a simple one. I won't pretend I handled it with perfect grace. There were months of barely civil communication. There were meetings where we sat at opposite ends of the same conference table and addressed each other through our attorneys because direct conversation felt impossible. There was a period when I genuinely believed the only workable outcome was a buyout. One of us purchasing the other's stake and ending the arrangement entirely. That didn't happen. What happened instead was slower and harder and I think more right. About 8 months after the estate was settled, Elliott came to my office. He didn't call ahead. He knocked on the open door and stood there with his hands in his pockets and said he needed to talk. I told him to sit down. He sat. What he said, over the next hour, was not an apology in any clean or complete sense. It was more like an inventory. He went through what he'd done, methodically, without excusing it, and described what he'd been thinking at each step. He said he'd convinced himself that the sale was the best outcome for the company and that I would eventually agree once I saw the proceeds. He said he told himself that Dad pragmatically would have approved. He said the moment the deal closed and the silence settled in, he knew he'd made the worst mistake of his life. I listened to all of it. I asked questions. Some of the questions were harder than I expected to ask and harder than he expected to answer. At the end, I told him that what he'd done had not destroyed us, that what he'd done had not destroyed the company, that Dad had seen to it, with his usual thorough, unhurried care, that neither thing would happen. I told him I thought Dad had known us both better than we'd known ourselves, and that the structure he'd built wasn't just a legal document, it was a statement about what he believed we were capable of, together, if we were required to work together and couldn't take shortcuts around each other. Elliott was quiet for a long time after that. Then he said, "Do you think he knew I would try to do it?" I told him I thought Dad knew it was possible, and I thought he decided the answer wasn't to prevent it after the fact, but to make it not possible in the first place. We have run Alderman Fabrication together for 3 years now. It is not easy. It is not warm, but it is functional, and it is honest. And the company, the 67 people who work there, the clients who depend on it, the institutional knowledge that would have been swallowed whole by a conglomerate acquisition is intact. Carl retired last year with a full pension. My father had ensured that provision too. On the day Carl retired, we held a small celebration on the floor of the shipping department, which Carl had helped build. Someone had put up a photo of my father, a candid shot from maybe 20 years ago, standing on that same floor with his arms crossed and a look on his face that I can only describe as quietly satisfied. I stood under that photo and looked at it for a long time. He had known, he had prepared, he had trusted the structure he built to do what it was designed to do, and it had done exactly that. That is the whole story. I have one question for you, and I'd like you to think about it before you answer. Have you ever had someone protect you from something without telling you they were doing it? Have you ever looked back at a moment and understood, later, that someone else had been several steps ahead the whole time? Tell me in the comments. I want to know your story.